a bell that tolled too late, a brotherhood that prayed too softly, and a parchment that waited in silence. Somewhere beneath the ancient arches of a remote abbey, a monk fell from the tower, but the truth did not fall with him. What was whispered behind stone walls may echo louder than any sermon. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. Settle in, and let's get started. The village of Lambsbridge lay folded among the heathered hills like a hymn too old to be remembered and too holy to be sung. From its crooked lanes and moss-covered thatches, one could always look upward, not toward the clouds, but to the austere silhouette of the Abbey of St. Oswald, whose bell tower rose not like a steeple, but like a warning. It was not a place for sermons, but for silence, and not even silence of peace, but of something deeper, a silence so practiced, so ritual, it seemed carved in stone. It was the feast of St. Sylvanus, and the villagers moved with the slow grace of generations who had never quite stopped mourning the dead. Processions formed without instructions, candles were lit without need of matchsticks, and the smoke curled upward in a gesture that was not quite prayer and not quite habit. No one asked who St. Sylvanus was, of course. He was a martyr. That was enough. All martyrs are remembered not for what they said, but for what was done to them. And from the high cloisters, behind stone too thick for sunlight, the monks prepared themselves with the practiced repetition of 1,000 identical days. They prayed for the dead, or perhaps for the living, but in truth they prayed mostly for the bell to ring again. For the Abbey's bell was the Abbey's breath, and some feared it had grown tired of speaking. Father Brown arrived with no more ceremony than a shadow falling across a cloister wall. His cassock was travel-worn, his hat as rumpled as his thoughts, and his umbrella, though dry, hung at his side like an apology. He had come to see the retired abbot, who was recovering from a small stroke and a great number of opinions. The monks greeted him with respectful uncertainty. Not suspicion, precisely. Father Brown did not inspire that, but the sort of quiet bewilderment with which one greets an unexpected sparrow inside a church. He was allowed to walk the cloisters freely, to sit in the worn wooden pews, to watch without asking questions. That, after all, was the danger with Father Brown. He watched things that no one else thought to hide. As the sun began to retreat behind the western ridge, the preparations for the evening liturgy intensified. Incense drifted through the air like forgotten confessions, and sacred vestments were laid out with a care that suggested fear, not reverence. And still, Father Brown said nothing. He merely looked up, not at the crucifix, but at the bell tower, and narrowed his eyes as if waiting for something older than sound. At the hour of Compline, when the valley dipped into its evening hush, and even the sheep seemed to pause their grazing, the bell was meant to speak. It always had. It was not a joyous bell, nor a sorrowful one, but rather a grave, solitary tone that gave the village permission to sleep and the monks permission to mourn. Yet on this night the bell did not ring. Instead, there was a pause. Not silence, but a pause. The kind of space into which the soul leaps with its worst imaginings. The villagers looked up, puzzled but not panicked. One or two crossed themselves. Inside the abbey, the monks froze, not with fear, but with the terrible knowledge that something had moved without liturgical consent. And in that quiet that now felt unnatural, Father Brown remained seated, his eyes still on the tower. The sound that did not come seemed somehow louder than ever before. Brother Lucian, the youngest of the novices, was sent. It was not a command exactly, merely a glance from the sub-prior and a slight nod as if the old ways would be satisfied if someone made the proper journey. The stone steps coiled upward like a serpent disciplined by centuries of solemn feet. Lucian ascended with the timidity of someone unsure whether he was being punished or sanctified. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became, not the cold of weather, but of memory. Dust clung to the walls in a way that made it seem purposeful, as though it had been assigned there by the rule. The lantern in his hand trembled slightly, not from any gust of wind, but from the nearness of a place where sound should have lived, and now didn't. When he reached the final stair, he paused. The bell loomed above him, and something else lay below it. There, beneath the great timber that bore the weight of the iron bell, lay the body of Prior Anselm. His limbs were arranged in no discernible posture, neither of prayer nor rest, and his head was turned slightly, as if listening for something that had not come in time. The rope to the bell hung untouched. There was no mark upon the floor, no sign of struggle, save for a strange stillness in the air, a kind of exhausted violence. Lucian stood frozen, the lantern in his grip casting long, trembling shadows over the beams and bolts above. It was not the sight of death that unnerved him, but its position. To die at the foot of the bell was one thing, to die at the top, with nothing but stone, rope, and sky around you, that was another. When the others arrived, in pairs, in whispers, they too did not speak at first. One brother crossed himself. Another turned away. A third began to kneel, then thought better of it. And Father Brown, who had followed neither swiftly nor slowly, looked not at the corpse, but at the bell itself. He studied the yoke, the cleft in the wood, the placement of the rope, and the dust that had been moved just enough to trouble the conscience, but not enough to disturb the soul. "This is no place to fall," he murmured softly, "but perhaps a place to be pushed into silence." By the time the bell was rung at last, it was no longer to announce prayer, but to summon consequence. The sound, when it came, did not roll through the valley like it once had. It trembled, cracked, then settled into a tone too rich for comfort. The villagers looked up from their supper tables and shook their heads. Something had gone wrong in the abbey, something sacred had failed to keep its shape. Within the cloisters, the monks assembled, not to speak, but simply to stand, together and yet apart, like statues waiting to be named. The abbot, still pale from his convalescence, was wheeled into the chapel but did not ask questions. He merely looked at Father Brown and blinked, as though awaiting absolution he had not requested. Father Brown stood among them, unnoticed, in the way only he could be. His hands folded, his eyes cast low, he did not need to speak, because the bell had. And though it had rung too late for the living, it might yet wake the truth from where it slept, curled in the rafters like a guilty prayer left unanswered. Even among the most ancient stones, news travels faster than time. Before the bell had finished its belated lament, its failure, and what was found in its shadow, had already begun to settle like incense in the abbey corridors. But the scent it left behind was not of reverence. It was speculation, cloaked thinly in Latin, and thicker still in fear. Some murmured that the prior had taken ill, struck down by the long climb, or some divine vertigo. Others whispered of fainting spells or private penance turned too extreme. Yet none spoke directly of what they all knew, that there was no proper cause for death in such a place, and that nothing in the abbey had ever fallen out of order unless it had been pulled. In the great hall, monks passed each other with bowed heads and sideward glances, each bow just slightly too deep, each silence just slightly too long. The rule was not broken, but it bent gently around their unease. Father Brown wandered nowhere in particular. He was not drawn to the drama of mourning robes or the tension of downcast eyes. Rather, he paused beneath the hanging rope that led up to the tower, still coiled, untouched, and curiously clean. It was there, among the hush of ritual and half-hearted theories, that he stood a little too long, not listening to the brothers, but to something else. Something quieter than silence, and heavier than sound. The bell rope should have shown signs of distress, a scuff of the hand, a shift in its knot, even the faint warmth of recent use. but it stood as it always had, composed and motionless, like a monk who had never been asked a question. Father Brown did not touch it. He had long learned that the sacred and the sinister often shared fingerprints, but he looked at it for a very long time, as if expecting it to twitch from memory or admit something it had held back. If the bell had not rung, the rope had not been pulled. If the rope had not been pulled, the tower had not been summoned. And if the tower had not been summoned, then the prior's presence there must have been for some purpose not heard, but hidden. He turned away slowly and walked through the transept, not as if seeking a person, but as if testing the air for contradiction. It was not the absence of noise that troubled him. It was the absence of question. The bell had not rung, the rope had not moved, and yet something, or someone, had climbed the tower. That was the first sermon no one had preached. The village constable arrived late enough to miss the moment, but early enough to misunderstand it. He entered the abbey with the formality of one wearing shoes too polished for the ground beneath them, and with a notebook too small for the weight of the silence around him. He was a decent man, and he asked decent questions. Had the prior been unwell? Who had last seen him? Was there any sign of disturbance in the tower? The monks answered as monks do, with facts softened by humility and omissions wrapped in courtesy. The constable, growing slightly uneasy, attempted once or twice to impose a kind of rural logic upon the scene, but found it crumbled somewhere between the Latin and the incense. Father Brown did not interrupt. He watched. The constable, he thought, was not unlike a man trying to weigh a psalm on a butcher's scale, and yet the questions lingered like dust in the beam of a stained glass window, neither seen nor settled. When the constable closed his notebook with a small, puzzled sigh, he glanced at Father Brown, as if seeking help, but the priest merely nodded politely and turned back toward the nave. The bell, after all, had not been struck, nor had the truth. The faces of the monks in the cloister were not so much distressed as displaced, as though each man had been shifted half an inch from where he usually stood in the divine geometry of monastic life. They were grieving, perhaps, but more than that, they were misaligned. Brother Gilbert, the abbey's treasurer, stood with folded hands and downcast eyes, murmuring a litany that seemed to have no beginning and even less conviction. Brother Clement, younger and more rigid, adjusted his scapula too many times, as if decorum might distract from doubt. Brother Maurice did not move. He stood by the cloister garden, beneath the weathered statue of St. Benedict, and stared not at the earth or the sky, but at the stones beneath his feet. It was not the stillness of prayer, nor the defiance of secrecy. It was a kind of inward gravity, the heaviness of a man keeping something from escaping, rather than something from entering. Father Brown observed them all with an expression that was neither judgment nor sympathy. He simply watched. It was not what they said that concerned him, but what they failed to ask. None of them inquired why Anselm had climbed the tower at all, as if the answer were known, or worse, agreed upon. And yet, as Brown's gaze paused on Brother Maurice, a slight tremor passed between them. Not a gesture, not a word, but the recognition of something shared. A silence, not empty, but sealed. Even among those who spoke, the most important things remained unsaid. Father Brown drifted through the abbey like a leaf on still water, carried not by wind, but by weight, the unseen kind which drags thought downward into depth. It was not evidence he sought, it was motive, disguised as decorum. He thought of the bell rope, untouched and unclaimed. He thought of the body placed at the foot of something meant to proclaim, not to crush. He thought of the tower itself, so elevated in structure, yet so secret in purpose. There was in all of this a kind of liturgical deceit, a choreography of silence that had not been broken by violence, but merely revealed by it. He passed beneath the chapel archway where Anselm once gave homilies, and paused before the votive stand. The candles were still burning, but none had been lit that morning. They had been left overnight, untouched, just like the bell. Brown did not speak to anyone, but something within him murmured, not a theory, not yet, merely a whisper, that a vow had been made, not to protect innocence, but to preserve appearance, and such vows, when broken, leave no sound at all. The constable closed the gate behind him with a polite nod, and the mild disorientation of a man departing a foreign language he had never quite decoded. The abbey returned to its ordinary stillness, but something in that stillness had changed. Father Brown remained near the cloister steps, his gaze turned not inward, like the monks, nor outward, like the visitors, but slightly upward, toward the tower and its unrepentant silence. He did not raise his voice. He merely allowed his words to fall softly into the air, like ash settling on vestments. Why was he there? The phrase hung there, suspended between rafters and reason. No one answered. Brother Gilbert cleared his throat faintly, as if startled by the simplicity of it. Brother Clement shifted his weight. Brother Maurice closed his eyes for a fraction too long. It was not an accusation, nor even a suspicion. It was simply a truth-shaped hole in the story. Why had Anselm, who kept no duties in the tower, who suffered from vertigo, who rarely left the scriptorium, why had he climbed the stairs on the eve of a feast, alone and unsummoned? No one had asked, but now it had been asked, and someone had begun to answer silently. By morning, it was not the bells that summoned inquiry, but the absence of parchment. A single document, sealed in wax of ecclesiastical red and marked in Anselm's own narrow hand, with the words "confidential, not to be opened until after my death," had vanished from his study. No monk had broken the seal, they said, though some had surely noticed it. It had rested upon his desk for 3 days, like a relic offered to time, untouched, yet present, as though daring the eyes of those sworn not to see. Now it was gone. Father Brown stood for a long moment before the small wooden writing desk. He did not touch it. He merely studied the space where a letter had once rested, and which now held only dust and implication. There was no sign of force, no hint of disarray. Indeed, it was the very tidiness of the absence that spoke loudest. It is always more suspicious, he thought, when something disappears gently. And though he said nothing to the abbot, who sat quietly near the window with a blanket and a glass of warm milk, Father Brown's thoughts stirred like incense rising from a cold thurible. He knew that silence could serve justice, but it could also disguise it. The letter, whatever it said, had not been taken by accident, and it had not been meant for the curious, it had been meant for God. Father Brown did not interrogate, he conversed. He did not accuse, he wondered. And he did not ask questions designed to entrap, only those that seemed too simple to fear. He moved softly through the cloisters, pausing now and again as if distracted by architecture or amused by lichen. He nodded to the gardener, greeted the kitchen novice, remarked on the weather to the sacristan, and all the while he watched. Not eyes, but footsteps, not reactions, but refusals. When he spoke to Brother Clement, he asked only whether the feast's readings had been copied in time. When he stopped beside Brother Maurice, he inquired whether the bells had been oiled last winter. And to Brother Gilbert he said nothing at all, only looked at the man's hands, folded so tightly they seemed not in prayer but in pressure. It was the silence, not the answers, that gave him pause. The answers were respectable, informative, and wrong in all the right places. No one asked him why he had come. No one asked what he suspected. And he, in turn, offered no suspicion, only a presence. For sometimes the clearest questions are the ones that make others answer themselves, without knowing they've spoken. It was an old sacristan, a woman who came each year from the outer parish to clean the sanctuary brasses, who offered the thread that bound the silence. She remembered, as older women always do, what no one else dares call memory. Over tea in the corner of the cloister kitchen, she said plainly, "Father Anselm met with them, you know. One at a time, not in the same room, not in the same day even, but with each of them, quietly, and all three walked out differently. Father Brown stirred his tea without tasting it. "Which three?" "Gilbert, Maurice, and the young one, Clement." "And when was this?" "Last week, Father, just before the feast novena, after Vespers. You'd think no one noticed, but the stones notice. The doors close slower when something is unfinished." The priest nodded, not as if surprised, but as if gently confirming a suspicion too humble to call a theory. He understood now that Anselm had not merely discovered something, he had begun to undo something, the kind of truth not meant for scandal or punishment, but for the soul. Whatever had passed between them had not been spoken aloud since. But it had lingered, like the breath of incense in a locked sacristy, faint, persistent, and not quite holy. When Father Brown inquired whether the bell tower had been accessible in the days before the tragedy, Brother Gilbert offered a small smile too carefully rehearsed. "No, Father, it was locked, for repairs. The beams, they creak in bad weather." Brown's brow furrowed not with doubt, but with disappointment. "I didn't notice a key missing." "The sub-prior keeps the keys, all accounted for, I'm sure." "Of course," Father Brown replied mildly. "As are the beams. No damage, I hope?" Gilbert's hands twitched just slightly before retreating into the folds of his robe. "None visible." Father Brown did not press. He merely glanced upward toward the high windows where the tower stood, solemn and aloof. There are places, he thought, that are locked, not with keys, but with agreements. It had not been the door that closed access to the bell tower. It had been the will of those who believed that silence could protect what truth might undo. The tower had been closed, not physically, spiritually, like an eye that refused to see, not because it was blind, but because it had once seen too much. Something in the abbey had changed, not broken, not confessed, but altered like a hymn sung in the wrong key. The monks moved through the hours with devotion still intact, yet something within their rhythm had misstepped. Father Brown noticed it most in the bell itself, which hung not merely heavy but hesitant. He could not explain it, nor did he try. But he knew the difference between silence that waits and silence that warns, and within those walls of stone and vow it was no longer clear whether they had buried a man or something deeper that he had tried at last to speak. Father Brown did not raise his voice when he spoke of the silence. He did not speak of conspiracy nor even of guilt. He merely remarked, as one might speak of a hymn slightly out of tune, that it was not always sin that bound men together, but shame. "I don't think," he said gently, "that Father Anselm died because of what he knew. I think he died because of what he could no longer bear not to say." The monks listened, if they could be said to listen at all. Their eyes were lowered, their hands folded, their stillness more ancient than obedience. But a few flinched, barely, when Brown continued. "You see, it wasn't a secret of violence, it was a pact of silence, and that's more dangerous in places where truth is meant to ring like bells." He was not accusing them. That was the unbearable part. He spoke like a man recalling a parable and leaving the interpretation to others. And that is what left the air so heavy in the cloister, the knowledge that this silence had not been born of cowardice, but of something more pious and more perilous. Anselm perhaps had agreed once, but pacts age poorly, especially the ones that require the soul to whisper when it was meant to sing. It was not one of the monks, but a woman who remembered the storm. She was the visiting sacristan from the Valley parish, a woman of inconspicuous age and formidable memory, who had come each feast for over 20 years to polish the old candlesticks and correct the misfolded linens with maternal severity. Over the silver basin, as her cloth moved in slow arcs, she spoke, not to anyone in particular, and certainly not with dramatic flair. But her voice carried the weight of something too long delayed. "It was after the flood," she said, "the year the river climbed the hill like it had been summoned." Father Brown looked up with the smallest incline of his head. The vestry was damp, the lower shelves ruined, but it wasn't the wood that troubled them. It was the chalice. What of it? Gone. Stolen? Vanished, she said, with the same tone one might use for a prayer long unanswered. They blamed the water, then the rust, then time. But the chalice didn't dissolve, it disappeared. And nothing was done? She shrugged. The abbey had already suffered. Why suffer scandal too? Brown did not answer, but something in his silence agreed, not with the decision, but with the logic. It was the kind of silence that could be canonized by custom, the kind that looks like peace from far away. It was a curious thing, Father Brown thought, how the worst kind of theft is the one that leaves nothing broken. The chalice, sacred by tradition more than design, had been passed through centuries of trembling hands, only to vanish as though it had never borne wine at all. There had been no investigation because no scandal had been declared. There had been no blame because no proof had been required. What remained was not a mystery, but a memory treated like myth, too delicate to disturb. But Anselm had remembered, and Anselm had watched 3 men age beside him with the kind of quiet one reserves not for enemies, but for collaborators. Father Brown pondered how the chalice, once meant to be lifted high in sacrament, had instead become a buried thing, not hidden in a wall perhaps, but in the hearts of those who feared what light might show. A chalice never spilled leaves, no stain, but it also leaves no absolution. There was a kind of choreography in guilt, a movement too slight to be conscious, too consistent to be accidental. Brown noticed it when brothers Gilbert, Morris and Clement crossed each other's paths in the cloister without greeting, or when one would turn too quickly from another's approach, as if evading not eyes but memory. It was not merely suspicion that bound them, but sequence. They shared something not present, but past. And it was Anselm who had walked into the centre of that silent triangle. Each had met with him before the feast. Each had emerged changed, not shaken, but adjusted, like men who had rehearsed contrition, but not completed it. They were not summoned, Father Brown murmured. They arrived. The sacristan's story now curled back like incense toward the vestry, and the chalice that had vanished not with theft, but with trembling conscience. The truth, it seemed, had not been buried, merely divided, shared like communion but without blessing. Anselm had, for a time, carried their pact like a relic, honoured and hidden. But at some point it had ceased to be sacred, and a thing ceases to be sacred when it demands secrecy more than truth. The door had been closed years ago. It had taken a body beneath a bell for someone to open it again. It would have been easy, Father Brown thought, to imagine Anselm as the architect of the silence, a man of rank and robe, holding secrets for the good of the house. But that was not the shape of it. Anselm had not forged the pact, he had inherited it. The more Brown listened, not to answers, but to absences, the more he sensed that Anselm had been the last to know and the first to suffer from that knowledge. He had accepted the silence, perhaps, but not entirely, and certainly not willingly. In his final days he had become restless, not in body, but in soul. He had spoken more softly, but with heavier pauses. He had walked longer in the cloister, but avoided the vestry. The missing letter, the sealed confession, had not been a weapon. It had been a key, not to expose, but to unlock what had been sealed too long. There are vows made before God, and there are pacts made before men. The tragedy comes when one is mistaken for the other. And Anselm, it seemed, had stopped mistaking. It had been said, with practised calm, that the vestry was locked the night Anselm died, that no one could have entered, that no one did. But Father Brown, in his gentle manner, asked only this: whether a door must creak to open, whether a lock must turn to yield, whether silence, once rehearsed long enough, does not become its own permission. There are doors that need no keys, not because they are left ajar, but because those who enter do so invisibly beneath the weight of shared omission. And there are rooms that feel locked even when they are not. Brown stood at the threshold of the vestry and said nothing. But he noticed the wax from a candle not lit. He noticed the dust disturbed in patterns too human to be times alone. And he thought not of entry, but of access, the kind that comes not through hinges, but through history. The night was not yet cloaked in darkness, but clothed in something softer, a kind of velvet stillness that muffled the stars and wrapped the abbey in a hush older than sleep. Father Brown walked alone, the stones beneath his feet seeming to echo, not with sound, but with memory. He made no announcement of his ascent. The monks, occupied with evening readings and gentle gestures, scarcely noticed his absence. That was the way with Father Brown. He did not vanish, but he was very good at not arriving. The tower waited, not welcoming nor forbidding, but impassive, as if withholding breath. The stairs spiraled as they always had, narrow and penitent, pressing the walker into contemplation with each turn. And Father Brown, climbing slowly, did not so much count his steps as confess to them. Halfway to the summit, he paused. There is something strangely unholy, he thought, about a sacred place that knows it harbours a lie. The bell above had failed not by silence, but by command. Its voice had been withheld, not by accident, but by arrangement. And if something had been spoken in this tower before Anselm's fall, it had not been heard by men. It had only been heard by heaven. Among the wooden struts and iron braces of the bell frame, Father Brown moved not as an investigator, but as one who listens for things no longer speaking. It was there, nestled in a crevice between dust-laden beams, that his eye caught a shard, not of wood nor rope, but something red, faintly glinting in the moon's reluctant light. It was wax. Not candle wax, which drips freely and without shape, but sealing wax, the kind that carries both authority and confession. He did not touch it. He had no need. Its presence was louder than its absence. So the letter had been here, or had come here, or had been brought here. The question was not which, but why. A seal is not a gesture, it is a sacrament of secrecy. It is not broken lightly, nor left behind by chance. Whatever had happened in the tower had involved not just a fall, but a choice to conceal or a choice to reveal, and between the two the wax had fallen. Father Brown stood for a moment, as if waiting for the bell to toll the answer. But the tower said nothing. The silence was not empty. It was full. The bell rope, weathered by years of faithful service, no longer bore the signs of devotion, but of deliberate neglect. It hung slightly awry, its fibres taut but not tensed, as if it had been pulled for something other than sound. Father Brown studied its knots, not priestly ones, those are neat and full of order, but clumsy, hesitant, improvised. Someone had tried to bind it, not to control it, but to restrain it. It had not been tied to ring, it had been tied to hold. The implication, as it drifted into his mind like incense into a closed chamber, was not that someone had failed to use the bell, but that someone had used the rope for another purpose altogether, not to announce truth, but to prevent it. There are many ways to silence a bell. One is to cut the tongue. Another is to tie the hand that would pull it. And the last, the most desperate, is to bind it with the weight of a man. He leaned slightly over the balustrade, eyeing the pattern of dust disturbed near the beam. It did not speak of struggle, but of stillness. Forced, perhaps, prevented, perhaps. A rope can carry weight, but not guilt. The guilt had been left for others to hear when no bell would sound it. There was a moment, not long, not sharp, when Father Brown simply stood still and listened to the place. Not for creaks or echoes, but for memory. He did not need to look at the bell again. It loomed not like an accusation, but like an unread scripture, always present, always misunderstood. the tower had once rung with truth. Weddings, burials, confessions wrapped in liturgy, all had passed through its tone. But now its very structure seemed changed, not broken, dimmed. The air did not move, the ropes did not sway, even the dust refused to fall. It was as if the tower, like the monks below, had agreed to hold its breath. And breath, Father Brown knew, is not merely for speech. It is for life. When one stops breathing, it is not only silence that arrives, it is death. The tower had not killed, but it had complied. Whatever pact had been made beneath the bell's shadow had been kept even unto death. And though the wood and stone could not weep, they could refuse to sing. Brown lowered his head, not in reverence, but in recognition. This was not a place where something had happened. It was a place where something had been stopped. By morning, the abbey stirred with its usual austerity. Matins spoken softly, breakfast served without remark, eyes avoiding eyes with the discipline of prayer. But in the refectory courtyard, beneath the reluctant sun, Father Brown found Brother Clement sweeping leaves that had not fallen. The young monk looked up as if expecting a question, and when none came, resumed his task with mechanical humility. Father Brown waited a long while. Then, as though speaking to the wall behind him, he murmured, "I found wax in the tower." The broom faltered for just a second. Clement recovered, but not well. "Candle wax, Father?" he asked too quickly. "No," said Brown gently. "Not the kind that lights a path, the kind that seals one." Clement swallowed something that was not a word. Brown's eyes, though kind, were now fixed. "It's curious, isn't it? A confession not given to a priest, but to a page, and perhaps taken from that page before it could be read." The silence was no longer the sacred sort. It was the defensive kind, the kind that hides behind ritual like a man behind a locked door. "I did not," Clement began, and then stopped. "No," said Father Brown with a nod almost imperceptible. "You did not write it. You did not even steal it, but you were there." The monk said nothing. His face was pale now, not with fear, but with something worse, recognition. For the bell had not rung, the letter had not been read, and yet the words meant for heaven, had already found the ears of a man who could not bear to hear them. And in that hearing, something fell. Not from the tower, but from grace. The mass that followed was, by all appearances, perfectly performed, a pageant of precision, as if each brother had learned to say nothing with divine fluency. Candles were lit, chalices raised, incense offered, but it was the air between these movements that held Father Brown's attention. He did not watch the altar so much as he listened to the soundlessness. For there is a silence born of reverence, and another born of fear, and though the shape of the mass remained, the spirit had been subdued. The words of the Gloria came, but they rang hollow, like bells wrapped in velvet. The chants harmonized with theological grace, yet there was no breath behind them, only the mechanical reverberation of duty. Father Brown, kneeling near the back, did not look upward. His gaze remained low, steady, almost mournful. For it is one thing to fear judgment, and another to fear truth, and the latter can turn worship into ritual and grace into gesture. This was not a mass for the soul, it was a liturgy held in suspension, like a prayer waiting to be believed. And within that hush, Father Brown felt not peace, but pressure, the weight of a bell that still refused to ring. It was during the Sanctus that Father Brown saw it, a small movement, barely a murmur, yet heavy with implication. One of the monks, kneeling with apparent devotion, was mouthing words not found in the liturgy. His lips moved in a rhythm out of step with the chant, his gaze fixed not upon the host, but somewhere within, or perhaps beyond. Brown watched with that peculiar kind of attention that does not judge, but mourns. He did not need to hear the words. It was the cadence that betrayed them. Not prayer, but repetition. Not praise, but pleading. The monk's lips moved as one speaks a vow, or recalls one. It was not the repetition of scripture, but the muttering of a phrase rooted in memory rather than doctrine. The moment passed, as such moments do. The monk closed his eyes, and the chant resumed its orderly passage through the nave, but something had been spoken, even if only in silence. After the final blessing, Father Brown lingered in the shadows, not to confront, but to confirm. He did not need to ask which brother it had been. In a place so steeped in silence, even an unspoken word can echo like thunder. And in that echo he heard again the whisper of the bell, not the sound it made, but the one it should have made. A bell silenced by men, and now mirrored in their mouths. The service had ended, but the incense clung to the stone like a ghost unwilling to depart. Father Brown found the abbot seated in the vestry, his robe gathered about him like a man retreating from winter, though the air was still. For a time, neither spoke. Then Brown, without accusation or insistence, observed gently, "There is something worse than hating the truth. It is fearing it." The abbot did not turn. His hands, clasped with effort, rested upon his lap, pale and still. "It was not murder, not truly," Father Brown continued, almost as if speaking to the wall. "Not in the way men imagine. It was fear, a fear disguised as reverence, dressed in silence, and fed with a dozen small agreements." Now the abbot looked at him, eyes wet not with tears, but with something harder, recognition. "They did not kill Anselm," Brown said. "They restrained him, held him, prevented the bell from ringing, as they once prevented the truth. And in that terrible moment, what they had feared most occurred. Truth arrived anyway, and shattered everything." The abbot said nothing. But in that nothing there was assent, for he too had once agreed to a silence meant to shield the church from scandal. But it had not shielded the church, it had only dimmed the light within it. "There was once," said Father Brown softly, as if recalling something ordinary, "a man who thought himself holy because he never raised his voice." The abbot, still seated, glanced at him with a flicker of dry amusement. Brown continued, "He never shouted in anger, never gossiped, never accused, and when he was wronged, he said nothing at all. But it was not virtue, it was vanity. He believed that if he did not speak his grief, he could remain pure." The silence thickened again. "One day," Brown went on, "he found that he could no longer speak at all. And in his dreams he heard his own voice crying out, not from his mouth, but from everything around him. The floorboards creaked with it, the walls wept it, his own silence had become a scream." The abbot looked away. "And what became of him?" "He was canonized," said Brown, almost cheerfully, "by men who misunderstood him entirely." Then more quietly, "But heaven knew better." And in that final line there was no jest, only judgment. Not of the man, but of the world that confuses reticence with righteousness and silence with sanctity. The abbot rose without a word and walked to the small crucifix above the hearth. There he stood, not praying, but remembering, and perhaps regretting. Father Brown remained behind him, his presence more comfort than pressure, as gentle as the dust on the old books beside them. "The parchment," the abbot murmured at last, his voice barely breaking the air. "I thought he would never use it." "He meant to," Brown replied. "Not to punish, but to release." The abbot nodded, slowly, the silence no longer protective, but penitential. "And now it cannot be read." "It has already been heard," said Father Brown. They stood together in the still room, not as judge and sinner, nor as priest and superior, but as two men who had both once mistaken restraint for redemption. And outside the bell still waited, not to condemn, only to speak. It was not a tribunal, and certainly not a public reckoning. When Father Brown asked that the brothers gather in the chapter house after none, It was with the tone of a man inviting others to remember something they had tried too long to forget. They came, not in haste, but in the slow, unsure manner of men returning to a place where the air still held the scent of old prayers and unspoken griefs. The room was cold, though not by temperature. It was the cold of memory and of judgment withheld too long. Father Brown did not stand at the head of the room. He did not raise his voice. He merely sat upon the stone bench and looked not at the faces before him, but at the space above them, as if speaking to the very dust that lined the high arches. "I have not called you here to accuse," he began. "There is no need, for what was done has already spoken, through silence, through wax, through rope." They said nothing, and that, too, was expected. "There was a pact," he said, "not of blood, but of silence, and it was kept more faithfully than truth." Brother Gilbert shifted slightly. Brother Maurice stared at the floor. Clement sat as if carved in stone. "And now," said Father Brown, "the bell has tolled, not with its mouth, but with its absence, and that sound was enough. There was no confession that followed, only listening, and that for the moment was all the truth would require." Father Brown spoke softly, not like a man revealing a crime, but like one unfolding a parable that had taken years to ripen. "It began," he said, "not with malice, but with clumsiness. A young monk, earnest, nervous, tasked with preparing the sanctuary before the feast. The rain was still falling that week. The ground trembled beneath the abbey, and the sacred chalice, already resting on weakened wood, slipped." He paused. Brother Gilbert did not move. "It shattered," Brown continued, "not into pieces, but into dilemma, a sacred object, broken, but not beyond repair. And so the real fracture began, not in the cup, but in the conscience." He looked at no one. Yet everyone knew. They spoke together, the three of them, Maurice, Clement, and the one who broke it. They swore no harm was done, that it could be replaced, that no scandal need stain the altar. He folded his hands. And the prior agreed. Anselm, who understood more than they realized, chose not to punish, but to protect. He carried their silence like a stone in his shoe, walked with it, bled with it, prayed through it. Brother Gilbert's lips trembled slightly, and so it passed. One feast, then another. The silence grew old, until the soul that bore it could bear it no longer. The chalice had shattered, but it was the silence that left the deepest shards. There is a weight, heavier than gold and sharper than glass, that lives within a man who has been entrusted with the sins of others, not to punish, but to carry. Father Brown turned now, not to the guilty, but to the memory of the man who had tried, at last, to bring daylight to the stone. Anselm, he said quietly, did not want vengeance. He wanted peace. But there is no peace in silence kept for the sake of appearances. There is no forgiveness for what is not spoken. The brothers said nothing, but silence, in such moments, becomes a form of speech. He began to change, Brown went on, to speak more often of the early fathers, of penance, of the danger of a truth buried in good intention. He wrote something, a letter, a confession, not to the world but to God. But perhaps he also meant someone to find it. He stood now, slowly. He climbed the tower that evening not as a guardian, but as a penitent. He did not go to hide, he went to reveal. And someone tried to stop him. The weight had grown too heavy for Anselm, but his death had made it heavier still for those who had thought the pact would hold forever. The brothers before him seemed older now, not by years, but by burdens suddenly remembered. Father Brown's voice did not rise, yet each word pressed downward like a hand on the soul. One of you followed him, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with fear, fear that the silence would end and the shame would return, that the illusion of sanctity would crack like the chalice once did. He took a slow breath. It wasn't murder, not as men define it. But it was no accident either. A hand reached for Anselm, not to strike, but to stop, not to destroy, but to delay. Yet the delay became too long, the grip too firm, the body too old. There was no outcry, no violence, only a weight, perhaps of an arm, perhaps of guilt, and then a fall. "He may not have even fought back," said Brown. "He might have understood, he might have even forgiven in that moment." Brother Maurice made a sound that was not quite speech, a dry breath caught in the throat of repentance. "It was not hatred," Brown repeated. "It was fear, dressed in piety, and fear has killed more saints than swords ever have." The tower had not condemned Anselm, nor had the church. It had been hands meant for prayer and hearts meant for peace that had tried to keep the past buried, and in so doing buried the only man brave enough to raise it. Father Brown's words now fell with the finality of absolution, not of sin, but of self-deception. This was not a plotted crime, he said, but a chain of cowardices. Each link small enough to seem harmless, each link forged from fear of scandal, from reverence misunderstood. He turned slightly toward the bell tower beyond the cloister wall. And yet that silence you preserved, it did not protect, it decayed, and in the end it demanded payment. He paused. It took him. The monks remained still. One wept, softly, without motion. Another folded his hands with too much care, as if afraid to let them fall open. Father Brown did not blame them. He knew too well that evil often enters wearing the robes of caution, and that it is not the loud sins, but the quiet justifications, that most wound the soul. "Anselm died," he said gently, "not because he broke the vow, but because he tried to break it open." He said no more after that. There was nothing left to prove, only something left to restore. As the monks dispersed, some with bowed heads, some with eyes raised at last, Father Brown remained a moment longer. He looked once more to the tower, then to the empty space where the chalice had once rested, and then to the spot in the cloister where Anselm had often walked alone. And that evening the bell rang. It did not peal with triumph. It did not toll with grief. It sounded once, full, hollow, high, and that was enough, for it was not a sound of death. It was the voice of a truth once buried, and now, at last, allowed to breathe. It echoed not through stone, but through the silence that had tried too long to replace it. And in that single note, the abbey remembered what it meant to speak. It was not discovery that led Father Brown to the sacristy shelves, but remembrance, a gentle kind of intuition born not of logic, but of spiritual familiarity. He had spoken little since the bell tolled the previous evening, and even less that morning. But there are silences that gather weight, like clouds before a rain, not of thunder, but of tears. He reached behind the third shelf, where the worn leather hymnals rested in quiet rows, some untouched since a feast long past. There behind one, too faded for use but too sacred for disposal, his fingers brushed parchment, brittle at the edges yet folded with care. He did not need to read the wax seal to know whose hand had closed it. There is a kind of reverence in certain mistakes, and Anselm's was of the kind that tried too hard to preserve the holy while letting the true go hungry. The parchment had not been hidden to disappear, only to wait. To wait for the one man who would not see it as proof, or evidence, or condemnation. Father Brown held it as one holds a relic, not of a saint, but of a sinner brave enough to name himself so. He did not smile, nor sigh, nor speak, but he closed his eyes for a moment, and it seemed the abbey exhaled with him. When Father Brown broke the seal, it was not with haste, but with a kind of quiet grief, like a man unwrapping a wound that time had not healed, only veiled. The wax gave way easily, as if it, too, no longer wished to hold what had long asked to be freed. The parchment inside was modest, its ink faded and unornamented. There were no names, no declarations. Only a single, continuous line of thought, curved like the humble path of an evening prayer. "I was wrong," it began, "not in what I did, but in what I did not undo." There were no details of the incident, no naming of those who had formed the pact. It was not a letter meant for prosecution, but for providence, a letter not to accuse, but to acknowledge. "I feared the scandal more than the sin," wrote Anselm, "and in that fear I betrayed both. The silence I blessed has become louder than any truth I might have spoken." There was a line crossed out near the end, a sentence begun with, "If I fall," but the ink had smeared, as if a tear had claimed it before regret could. Father Brown folded the letter again, though not with the precision of archivists. It had done its work. It had not condemned anyone, but it had condemned the silence, and that was enough. In the vestry, where cassocks hung like old shadows and incense clung to every beam, Father Brown sat across from the abbot, the letter laid between them like an unopened psalm. He read it aloud, not with the authority of a judge, but with the hesitancy of a man reading someone else's heart. The words passed gently between them, not hammering guilt, but ringing faintly of grace. The abbot, usually a man of careful composure, let his eyes remain closed throughout. When Brown reached the end, that faltering line, that almost prayer, smudged by grief, there was no sound but the faint ticking of the sanctuary clock. "He did not wish to blame," said Brown at last. "He only wished the truth would outlive him." The abbot nodded slowly. "And so it has." But then his voice caught, not from anger nor from scandal, but from something far more difficult, sorrow without bitterness. "We thought we protected the sacred," he murmured, "and instead we imprisoned it." Father Brown placed the letter beside the old missal. "Truth does not need temples," he said quietly. "Only witnesses." There was no absolution spoken between them, but there was a silence more honest than speech, the kind that follows a prayer not said aloud, yet answered nonetheless. Dusk came not with drama, but with the patient breath of evening, shadows stretching like benedictions, and the abbey roof gathering the hush of day's end. Then the bell rang. It was not the funeral tone of Anselm's passing, nor the grand peal of high feast. It sounded once, plain, resonant, and whole. And it rang not to mourn, but to mend. Monks turned their heads, not in alarm, but in understanding. For though no ceremony had called it, the sound was not out of place. It was, rather, the punctuation of a truth that had been waiting, like the letter, like the hymnal, like the man himself. Father Brown did not look up when it tolled. He only nodded as if the sound confirmed something he had known long before, but waited patiently for the world to hear. A bell, once bound to silence, now spoke again, not in accusation, but in release. Brother Maurice lingered long after the others had withdrawn to prayer. He stood by the cloister garden, eyes fixed not on the tower, but on the low stone wall where Anselm had once leaned in silence. There was no summons, no speech, only the stillness of a man reaching the end of avoidance. He walked at last to Father Brown, not quickly, nor dramatically, as one might approach a confessor, or perhaps a mirror. "I was the hand," he said softly. "I meant to hold him back, not to—" His voice trailed off, not from collapse, but from clarity. Brown did not interrupt. He only inclined his head. "You already knew," Maurice added. "I knew someone had meant well," said Brown gently. "That was the danger." Maurice said no more. But he did not walk away, and that perhaps was his beginning. A man turned, not broken, but ready. It was not the monks who first noticed, nor the abbot, nor even Father Brown himself, but a child, a gardener's son who passed the chapel each day on his way to the orchard's edge. Children, unlike clerics, are not trained to hear what they expect, but only what is. And one morning, as the bell called the monks to terce, the boy paused, frowned, and whispered to his mother, It doesn't sound like before. No one else remarked upon it. The note was the same in pitch, the rhythm unaltered, but somehow the tone, that faint aftertaste of metal on morning air, had shed its weight. Father Brown, who overheard this remark in passing, for he often lingered near the outer wall to smoke and think, merely smiled faintly. He did not correct the child. He only said, "That is because it speaks differently now." The mother, puzzled, asked what he meant, and Father Brown, with a simplicity that made his silence more profound, replied, "It used to say what wasn't so." The bell had not cracked nor changed its clapper, but it no longer tolled to cover. Now it tolled to confess. And truth, like sound, does not always become louder when it is freed, but it becomes truer. There had been quiet anxiety in the early days following the revelation. Whispers beneath vestments, unsure glances before vespers, and one pale-faced novice who asked the abbot if they ought to close the gates to visitors, just for a while. But the gates remained open, and the walls remained standing. Nothing cracked, nothing collapsed. The stone held, and perhaps more surprising still, the silence held too. Not the frightened, hollow silence of secrecy, but a newer kind, more like the hush of snow or the calm of a room after a storm. It had been feared that confession would scatter the faithful, as if truth were a fire to burn the altar bare. Yet what it did was clear the smoke. Even the abbot, who had once walked like a man balancing ceremony on his shoulders, began to breathe differently. Not louder, but deeper. There is a strength that comes not from shielding the sacred, but from letting the sacred shield itself. And so the abbey did not fall. It merely stood straighter. If one had walked the cloisters weeks before, the silence might have felt like tension, a silence of things left unsaid, of truths half swallowed, and steps muffled not by humility but by fear. But now the silence had softened. There were no songs added to the Mass, no new banners unfurled, and yet there was change, in the way Brother Ambrose polished the altar candlesticks as if polishing sorrow into mercy, or in how Brother Clement now read the epistles without his previous tremor of the throat. They did not speak of the tower, but neither did they flee from it. Each gesture, the setting of the chalice, the lighting of the sanctuary lamp, the folding of a worn surplice, bore the quiet gravity of penance, unspoken, but lived. Even the footsteps in the halls seemed less cautious, as though no longer afraid of echoing into memory. It was not that they had found peace, but perhaps they had ceased bargaining with guilt and begun to serve instead. There is a kind of grace that grows in silence, not the silence of hiding, but of healing. And the abbey, once haunted by silence, now dwelled in it, not afraid, but forgiven. Father Brown, sitting once again beneath the old bell tower with his umbrella across his knees, was asked by a passing visitor if the bell had been recast. "No," he replied after a moment, "it simply stopped pretending." The man blinked. "Pretending?" "Yes," said Brown, with the soft certainty of someone who had once heard a lie shouted from a pulpit and recognized it as prayer. "It used to lie by omission, a sort of noise to drown what no one dared speak." "And now?" "Now," said Father Brown, "it doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to argue. It just rings. And because it tells the truth even once, it doesn't need to be loud." He tipped his head back and listened to the bell's absence. "That's the thing about truth," he added. "It doesn't insist. It simply abides." When Father Brown descended the Abbey Hill that afternoon, the grass gave a gentle rustle beneath his steps like something whispering Amen. He did not look back, not because he was done with the place, but because it had spoken. And in places that speak truly, even once, one does not need to linger. The wind brushed against the folds of his coat as if recalling the toll that once masked a fall and now named a forgiveness. There are hills that hide sins, and then there are hills that remember, not to punish, but to preserve. This was such a hill. It was not the habit of Father Brown to write long letters, and certainly not long letters to Flambeau, for the man, like all true reformed souls, preferred the quiet struggle of action to the indulgence of analysis. But on this grey afternoon, long after the Abbey had exhaled its confessions and returned to its psalms, Father Brown sat at a modest desk in the vestry and put pen to paper with a slowness that was almost reverent. He did not recount the particulars of the crime, the heights from which Anselm fell, nor the hands that trembled and withheld. What he wrote instead was of something less sensational and more terrible, the slow corrosion of conscience under the illusion of piety. "My dear Flambeau," it began, "men do not always sin in rebellion. Sometimes they sin in reverence, reverence turned inside out." He described, with the gentleness of a mourner, not the collapse of the tower, but the collapse of courage. Not the guilt of murderers, but the grief of men who could not bear to break the illusion of sanctity. He paused often, not to seek words, but to be sure he did not write too many, and somewhere in the middle of the page, as if the thought had risen uninvited, he added, "It is a hard thing when the defence of the holy requires the denial of the true." The ink dried as silently as the grief it carried. The pen moved slowly now, not from hesitation, but from heaviness, the sort of moral fatigue that descends only after one has touched truth with bare fingers and found it cold. Father Brown's hand trembled slightly as he wrote. "It is a strange thing, Flambeau, that men who would never raise a knife in anger may still injure with a silence sharpened by good intentions." He thought again of the chapel, not shattered, but subtly bruised, the way a child's face may remain calm after tears, but with something in the eyes forever altered. "They did not wish to harm the church," he wrote, "only to protect it. But in shielding its image, they abandoned its soul." There was something monstrous, he mused, in the way virtue can become a mask, not for vice but for fear. The monks had not been liars in the ordinary sense. They had simply loved the appearance of holiness more than its cost. "A man may die for the altar," he added, "and still betray it in how he dies." He laid the pen down for a moment and stared at the small wooden crucifix on the far wall, plain, chipped, but somehow more honest than the gilded ones that had watched Brother Anselm fall. Perhaps it was easier to revere a perfect God than to admit a broken church. But God had never asked for reverence without truth. When Father Brown folded the letter at last, sealing it with wax still warm from the vestry lamp, a sound emerged from above, not abrupt, not accidental, but steady and measured. The bell. It rang with neither alarm nor summons. It told not to call monks to prayer, nor to mark the death of a soul. It simply told, as if, at long last, it had found its rightful voice. Father Brown did not rise. He only listened. It was a noble sound, solemn without theatre, and full without force. A sound that seemed to say what no man had dared say until too much had happened. He reached for his coat, not to go, but because habit had taught him that endings often arrive disguised as continuations. In the margin of the letter, just before placing it into the envelope, he scribbled one final line. "The bell speaks now, but only because it was not allowed to speak then." There are tolls meant for warning, and tolls meant for mourning, but some tolls come not for either. They come too late, and therefore tell the truth more clearly than the living ever could. Father Brown remained seated long after the bell fell silent, as though its last note had not yet left the stone walls, but drifted somewhere higher, past wood, past steeple, past air. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in that peculiar posture of inward listening, as if waiting to hear whether heaven had noticed the toll. "The bell never lied," he murmured, as one might speak to an old friend whose integrity had been questioned for too long. "It only rang when it could." There had been no deceit in the metal, no conspiracy in the clapper. Only men. men who hushed the truth with robes and whispered prayers and assurances that holiness must never bleed. But truth, Father Brown had often found, does not die from silence. It waits there, beneath the stone, beneath the vestments, until a toll, even a late one, sets it free. He stood slowly, placing the sealed letter in the satchel at his side. The silence that returned was not empty now, but filled with what had been said too late, and thus spoke forever. And as he made his way down the narrow corridor, he did not look back at the bell tower. Because some witnesses need no audience, they only need time. Some truths told softly, not to accuse, but to remind us that even silence bears witness. And do you believe that a sacred place can remain holy even when men within it falter? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to read your thoughts. If you enjoyed this mystery, leave a like, share it with someone curious, and don't forget to subscribe for more timeless enigmas.